Hello, welcome back to my channel. So today I want to do a video comparing and contrasting extroverted sensing and introverted sensing, or abbreviated SE and SI. So extroverted sensing is predominantly valued by the SP types in the Myers-Briggs system and secondarily valued by the NJs. Introverted sensing is primarily valued by the SJ types and secondarily valued by the NP types. So for this reason, if you value one of these functions, you don't value the other one. So like I've been saying with all these videos, it can be kind of easy to make value judgments. I think a little less so with the perceiving functions than with the judging functions, but I want to keep it really objective and unbiased, and I want to just take a look at quotes that Carl Jung and van der Hoop said, and really what are these terms? So in looking at their writing, the word most commonly used for extroverted sensing was sensation, and I kind of felt like maybe that was cheating, like, does sensation count if it's called extroverted sensing? Like, can you use the word in the definition? But I ended up making an exception for it because I feel like that's really what best encapsulates it. So the definition of sensation is a physical feeling when the body perceives an external stimulus, one of the faculties of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch, particularly that arouses interest and excitement. So I kind of spliced together two definitions there. Part of the word like sensational, or it's a sensation. So that's the interest and excitement, because there were a lot of quotes about arousing interest and excitement in the SE section. So I felt like that was definitely an important part of the definition. For introverted sensing, there wasn't one word that was most commonly used. I would definitely say that I saw the word archaic a lot, and I saw the word reserved a lot. I also saw the word passive a lot, so I've included that here. So it talks a lot about, when it talked about archaic, it talked about having an archaic lens, or when they look at something, they throw an archaic luster over the thing, or an age-old consciousness over the thing. So not merely just seeing the object, but throwing a luster over it. So this archaic lens having an old-fashioned flavor, or an old-fashioned lens through which they see things. Passive, accepting or allowing what happens or what others do without active response or resistance. And then reserved, restrained in words or actions. So I didn't want to use these two words, archaic and reserved, because I just felt like neither one on its own is really encompassing the full thing. I mean, no word really can, but I want an anchor word for these things that really, work. So I have a word in mind that was not used in the text ever, but I think that it works enough, if you guys will allow me to. I'm really trying to hone my definitional skills in TI or whatever, so there might be a better word, but, because no one single word can be a good anchor word. But if you hear me out, I think the word conservative can work because it can be used in many different ways. So conservative can mean tending or disposed to maintaining existing views, conditions, or institutions, or traditional. So traditional was used a lot. That was a word that was used a lot, traditional. So I think that kind of keys in on this archaic nature, like viewing things through a conservative lens or an old-fashioned lens. Conservative can mean to err on the side of caution, marked by moderation or caution. And there were lots of quotes about them being reserved. That was one of the key words, restrained, ponderous, caution. So I thought, erring on the side of caution, that really, keys into a big part of introverted sensing. You could say that someone dresses conservatively, so a reserved, modest dress. And so I feel like that kind of keys into that keyword reserved. Conserve, like you could say, like conserve the forest, or conserve energy, prevent wasteful use. And there were a lot of quotes about them having little inclination to activity and kind of a passivity in the sense of conserving energy. So I think when you take into account all these different ways that the word conservative can be used, I think that it's getting closer to being an anchor word of what introverted sensing is. Introverted sensing is such a fascinating function because there are many, many qualities wrapped up in there. Introverted sensing meaning an internal processing of sensory experiences, and that can be a bodily processing of experiences like comfort and, feeling the sensations within the body. It can also be an internal processing of experiences as in like the meaning behind memories and the timelessness of things. And, so there's a lot wrapped up within introverted sensing. So that's why it's really difficult with introverted sensing to come up with one word. But I think if you take into account all these different definitions of the word conservative, maybe that's getting as close as we can. But you can leave feedback in the comments. I spent a lot of time trying to get one word to work. Okay, so now I want to get into a metaphor. So extroverted sensing is like lightning to me. So lightning strikes as a sudden, momentary, powerful force. It represents intensity of sensation, in this case sight, and when paired with thunder, sound. It represents seizing the present moment and quick activity in reaction to stimulus. It's a very strong sense. It's a contrasted, you got the dark sky and all of a sudden this very bright light. So it's very contrasted. When you pair it with thunder, it's a very loud sound. So it's an intense sensory experience. It's very in the moment, sudden, fleeting, powerful, and it's very stimulating. So introverted sensing, on the other hand, my analogy is that it's more like this room. So similarly a storm, kind of like a thunderstorm. But it's not just the storm itself, but rather it's kind of looking at the storm through a subjective lens. A lot of the difference between SE and SI is kind of this internal processing of it. So a rainy day indoors is an opportunity for calm, gentle passivity. These were quotes that we'll come up with in a moment. Ideal for snuggling up with a classic novel, and it may stir and leave a distinct impression on an individual. It's an opportunity for developing the experience into the depth of the meaningful passing of time within the comfort of the familiar sphere without requiring inclination to activity. So it's more than just the objective sensing that's happening. It's more than just, boom, here's a lightning bolt. But it's kind of sitting in a very calm, passive way. There's a lot of quotes about their familiar sphere and being in kind of this cozy room surrounded by all these books. And I imagine that maybe they're kind of traditional works or works that have stood the test of time. That's a big emphasis with SI, is standing the test of time and a timelessness. And maybe this experience really marking them. You know, they said that it's not the intensity of the experience that will mark an introverted sensor. It's very subjective. You don't know what it's going to be. It could be some ordinary, everyday experience, and it's going to mark them. And this is just, you know, an everyday, rainy day indoors. And this could be something that really, you know, locks itself in the brain of the introverted sensor, and it's something that they'll remember for a long time. So now I want to get into the side-by-side quotes of extroverted sensing versus introverted sensing. So a word that came up with extroverted sensing a lot was being realistic, or being a realist. And that is to see objects as they are and are prepared to deal with it accordingly. Not seeing like the impression that an object makes on you necessarily when you're thinking about extroverted sensing in isolation, but just seeing it directly as it is and being able to deal with it accordingly, being able to hop into action. That's what being a realist is. Introverted sensing, on the other hand, is subjective. So it's not just merely seeing the objects, but it's got these like glasses on, these subjective glasses, you know, the lens through which you view the world. And so the lens that it talked about, the introverted sensor's view, it says sees objects through an age-old lens and the impression released from the object. So it's not just like in the case of that room that I just showed you for that metaphor. It's not just seeing the rainstorm, but there's an impression released from the storm. It's more than just the sensory experience, but there's some impression, and you don't know what it's going to be for the introverted sensor, but there's something released from it. This is another direct quote. So extroverted sensing sees the present and momentary existence, just like that lightning. It sees the present and momentary existence. It's not seeing the past, it's not seeing the future, but it's just seeing the present and momentary existence. What's happening right now, incredibly present. That's a great skill with extroverted sensing. Introverted sensing sees the becoming and passing of things. This is a direct quote from Carl Jung. And there were quotes about kind of like the timelessness, the unchanging nature. John Beebe calls it an access to the ancestral consciousness. So not just an access to the meaning within its own experiences, but access to the meaning of like the ancestors' consciousness, what he talks about, kind of the instincts within all of us. So it sees the becoming and the passing of things and what's going to be timeless, not the fads. Extroverted sensing can be, you know what, this is what the momentary existence is right now. And introverted sensing says, no, this is just going to be the becoming and the passing, and it has a nose and a knack for things that are going to be timeless and that are not going to be fads. The next one, this is a direct quote. Extroverted sensing can be impulsive, seizing, and strongly reactive. This is something that there were quotes about extroverted sensors being really into sport, for example, and it makes them really good at it. Or I've seen like ESTPs, for example, be very good at like Smash Bros, the video game, or Spike Ball. Really just when you're so in tune with the present moment, so that they're realists, which means you're in the present moment and being able to respond accordingly. Really good at things like that because they're so tuned into the present moment that it makes them really good in careers or activities where reactivity is going to be highly favored. You can kind of contrast this. Introverted sensing is restrained with rational self-control. So you never get the sense that introverted sensors have really like let loose. And these are particularly talking about like SE DOMs or SI DOMs, but there's restrained, reserve, rational self-control. And this restrained self-control makes introverted sensors really good in roles that, you know, require rational self-control, which is a lot of areas of life that are going to require self-control, and a lot of jobs do very well. This makes someone very responsible when you have this restrained self-control. Extroverted sensing values the intensity of the objective influence. So the loudest sound, the brightest lightning bolt. And then this was kind of contrasted with, there were quotes about they have a fine tuning of pitch to what is the correct sensation. So it's kind of this like paradox. So there are quotes about them really valuing the strongest sensation, while at the same time having a refined level to them of like what is the appropriate amount of sensation. You know, like loud music, driving fast in a car, eating a ghost pepper. You know, these are things, these are intense sensations that extroverted sensing is really interested in. Introverted sensing is not interested in just the objective intensity, like the loudness or the brightness, but the intensity of the subjective sensation constituent released by the object. So it doesn't have to be an intense experience. It could be just kind of a dreary, commonplace rainy day. But for some reason, that releases a very subjective thing released by the object, released by that rainy day. That rainy day releases something to the introverted sensor that's meaningful. And then that becomes part of their processed experiences that were meaningful to them for some reason. And then they carry that on throughout their lives. And it becomes one of these pieces in kind of this, one of the sentences in one of the chapters of the book of their life, and in all of humanity's life, just kind of seeing the progression of things. So you don't see introverted sensors seeking intense sensations like, you don't see it like lighting off fireworks or eating ghost peppers or things like that, because to them, that's not what the most meaningful thing is. And to them, it's a lot of times the most meaningful things are found in really commonplace situations, just an everyday experience that they find meaning in subjectively. There were quotes about them being charming, lively, jolly, and not passive. This is contrasted with introverted sensing, where they were very calm, calm and lively, very different. Not passive, that was a direct quote for extroverted sensing. Passivity, there were many quotes about introverted sensing being passive. And being reserved, that's kind of the difference. So very, very, very different. Both sensors, both looking at what is, but one's looking more objectively at what is, and one's looking through a lens of what is. And one thing that both of the sensing types talked about is there's, like with introverted sensing, it said that they don't like bluff or pretense, and they kind of see what they can do and what they can't do, just very matter-of-factly. With extroverted sensing, they are realistic about how things are, and that includes themselves. Extroverted sensing, the intensity of the sensation directs attention. That's a direct quote. Introverted sensing, experiences may stir and leave an impression. So with extroverted sensing, it's in the moment, it's very momentary. Whatever's the most intense sensation directs their attention right then. But then as soon as we're on to the next moment, there's new sensations, and that's what directs their attention right then. So they have this really amazing skill of being present. With introverted sensing, the experiences, they may or may not stir them. There were lots of quotes about them being stirred and leaving an impression. So when an experience leaves an impression on you, then in the future, some years from now, you may go back and like, wow, that really left an impression on me, and that really formed me. And as this chapter book of my life is going on, this is how it formed me into who I am today. And so it's a lot about more of the impression of an experience, an internal processing of your experiences that stirred you and left an impression on you, and then you can go back and access those things later. Again, extroverted sensing seeks intense and unusual sensations. So intense sensations, I'm thinking like, when I think of like a caricature of extroverted sensing, I'm thinking of like the Red Bull commercials where they're doing flips on like motorcycles. Unusual sensations like, let's all eat a ghost pepper. Like, it's not even, there were quotes about how sometimes they don't even like sensations that are objectively like good. they just want the intense sensations regardless of like if it's comfortable to eat a ghost pepper or not. On the other side, introverted sensing, it likes comfort. That's kind of the difference between like intense and unusual. Like eating a ghost pepper, that's not comfortable. So it's very contrasted. Introverted sensing likes comfort, and talk about they have a ponderous caution. So like ponderous caution, that is the opposite when you think of like a Red Bull commercial. That is not ponderous caution. So that's a huge differentiator between SE and SI. I've known a lot of ISTPs who actually think they're ISTJs just because that J nature, ISTPs lead with a J function, so it's easy for them to mistype because they kind of relate to that J-ness sometimes when you just think about the letter dichotomies. But even like ISTPs who have SE second, I think that they don't have a lot of ponderous caution. They might procrastinate, for example, but they'll do the ghost pepper eating or like riding the motorcycle or liking the fireworks or things like that. So that's a big difference. Whereas with introverted sensing, there were a lot of quotes about how they like the familiar sphere, kind of like the home. There's a coziness, a comfort, like that room on the rainy day, this ponderous caution. Just kind of this relaxing, calm nature. There were a lot of quotes about calmness. And a lot of times if you go to an introverted sensor's house, like they'll put on like relaxing piano music. They don't, you don't show up to their house and they got this intense music going, but it's like this calming piano music, maybe an acoustic guitar, folk type music, but usually very calm, comforting, very relaxing music. And it's very comforting environment. With introverted sensing, there were quotes about how they don't immediately like new or strange things. I mean, they're kind of passive toward it. They're not going to actively resist it, but they don't immediately like those things. They like the comforting, familiar things. Extroverted sensing as well, they like what is, but there were quotes about how they like what is with a spice of the new, particularly if that new thing enhances sensation. Extroverted sensing will go after and seize what catches their attention. Introverted sensing shows little inclination to activity. So this is just another big difference. Extroverted sensing, a lot of times you'll see them be very active, tapping, or they're walking around a lot, or they're snacking a lot. There's a lot of movement within their environment. There were quotes about extroverted sensing can be lazy, but I would say that on the whole, it's usually pretty active, usually in a career that requires some movement. If they're not in a career that requires movement, maybe they like a standing desk, or they don't like to sit for too long and they like to get up and move around. Introverted sensing shows little inclination to activity. So it's part of this calmness, this passivity, reserved. And a lot of times, they're perfectly content to just maybe go on a calming walk. But a lot of times they're just at home. Like, this is kind of the typical, like Rory Gilmore could be an ISFJ or an ISTJ, kind of just the typical book reading type person, very calm. So then finally, here are some key words from the previous series that I did. So, they're quite different from each other, even though they're both sensing functions, and both sensing functions look at what is. Extroverted sensing looks at what is directly without a subjective interpretation of it, and it likes to continue looking at things directly, and it likes intense sensory experiences, things that are stimulating. There were lots of quotes about wanting to enjoy things and sport, very engaged, excitement. We're getting these happy, more intense emotions: excitement, stimulating, curiosity, concrete, zest, interacting with objects, impulsive, seizing. So there's kind of this, like lightning, it's very intense, seizing. Introverted sensing is so different from that. While it is looking at what is, because they're both sensing functions, it's doing so through an age-old lens, a lens of age-old experience, through a traditional lens, through an old-fashioned lens, through subjective memory, as John Beebe calls it, ancestral consciousness. It's looking at things through a timeless lens. What's going to stand the test of time? And that gives a sense of caution to them and a sense of calmness. There are a lot of quotes about introverted sensing being very detail-oriented and thorough and responsible. There are a lot of quotes about them being pretty temperate and moderate in their views. There's a gentleness and a calmness to them. So very different. Even though similar sensing functions, they're very different to me. So like I said at the beginning, I will have the deep dives linked below in the description box. There are like 45-minute deep dives on each of these functions. I also have a playlist on each of the personality types. So like if you're an INFJ and you want to know every video that I've done that could apply to you, I have those playlists linked in the description box as well. Thank you so much for watching.